Hello and welcome to the Top 10 Misconceptions about Wi-Fi in the Enterprise, webinar presented by Dr. Avril Salter. I'm Christina Bartz from TrainSignal, and I'd like to take a minute to tell you what to expect in the next hour. First, I'd like to draw your attention to the questions box in your webinar control panel. Avril will be answering questions today, so please feel free to submit your questions during the presentation. Also, if you have technical difficulties, let us know in the questions box and we'll do our best to assist you. Please note that you are on mute. Today's presentation will be recorded and available to view on our blog. We'll email you the link after the presentation. After you exit the webinar, you'll be prompted to take a short survey. TrainSignal wants to hear from you, so please take a few minutes to complete the survey. We'll be choosing one participant from today's audience to receive a copy of Avril's course, Conducting Cisco Unified Wireless Site Survey. To be eligible to win, you must complete the survey that you will receive after the webinar. Be sure to fill it out. It only takes a few seconds. If you have additional comments or feedback, you can email us at webinars@trainsignal.com. And with that, thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Here's Avril.
Yes, hello everybody and welcome. So as Christina mentioned, I've developed with TrainSignal the Conducting Cisco Unified Wireless Site Survey course, and I thought today we'd take a look at some of the things that always catch people when they're working with wireless networks. And so I basically have put together 10 of the top issues that I find that people in IT decision makers, when they're rolling out their wireless networks, often run into problems with. So having said that, we'll start with the first one. So one of the most interesting things about wireless is, of course, you've got a changing RF environment. And when you're sending signals over the air, the way that you send those signals has to vary depending on those RF environments. And the better your RF environments, then the stronger your received signal is going to be. And the worse your RF environment, then the weaker the signal is going to be. So when the signals are really good, for instance, if I'm close to the access point somewhere over here, what that means is when I send the signals, which are radio waves like this, they can actually represent a lot more data than if you're out on the edge of the cell over here. So what that means is that if you're close and in good RF conditions, you can get up to higher data rates, and then as you move away from the access point, your data rate will drop. And in fact, you can try this with your computer. If you sign on your computer and take a look at the status and actually walk away from your access point, you will see your status will change from excellent conditions to good conditions to fair conditions, and your data rates will drop accordingly. And so this is one of the things to always remember when you're looking at deploying your wireless networks. If you want to have your users get the highest data rates, then you want to position your users close to the access point, or you want to shorten up the range, because it's only in these areas you can get the higher data rates, and out on the edges here your data rates are going to drop off. So either you want to eliminate these drop-off areas, or you're going to have some users which will experience lower data rates. The other thing that's interesting here when we look about these data rates then is to consider the throughput. So if you think about it, if your data rates here close to the access point are higher, and then your data rates out on the edge of the cell is lower, then your average data rate is going to be dependent on where your users are, and it's going to be somewhere between the highest data rate and the lowest data rate. But there's another factor that affects your throughput, and that is the way that Wi-Fi works is that Wi-Fi, before you transmit, you actually have to listen. And you have to listen to make sure the spectrum is clean. And only if the spectrum is clean do you then go ahead and transmit. And the question is, how long do you listen for? So if the medium has become free at this point in time, and I'm now listening, and I say, oh, during this time the medium is now free, I'll go ahead now and send my data frame, then what you can see here is that during this time I'm not actually sending any data. And Wi-Fi does this because it wants to avoid collisions with other devices that are operating in the same frequency. But what that means is that for a large portion of time, you're actually not transmitting. So if this was your average data rate, and you're actually only transmitting 50% of the time, your data rate is, your actual throughput is considerably reduced. So let me just make sure you understand that. Let's say my highest data rate is 100 megabits per second, and my lowest data rate is 10 megabits per second. Then my average data rate that I'm sending at, assuming everybody's somewhere in between, is about 55 megabits per second. But if I'm only transmitting 50% of the time, my actual throughput would be 25 megabits per second. So a lot of people get quite confused by this because they go, wow, my access point can get up to these really high data rates, and they forget that not every user can get to those data rates, and then they forget that Wi-Fi only transmits about 50% of the time. So they get quite disappointed when they find out the throughput is a much lower than the advertised highest data rate. And a lot of you have probably seen that with 802.11n, some of the vendors are promising data rates of 450 megabits per second, maybe even 600 megabits per second. You've seen that as well. And you'll be quite surprised to find out then your average throughput is more about 50 megabits per second. So really interesting to watch on that one. So let's now take a look at our third common misconception. So Wi-Fi operates in the unlicensed spectrum band, also called the license exempt. And what that means is that you don't need to pay a fee to operate your equipment in that spectrum. But it also means that anybody can operate in that spectrum. So it's a shared spectrum. And so that means that if you and I are both transmitting in that spectrum, then there's a possibility that we might interfere with each other. And again, Wi-Fi has been written to actually tolerate that level of interference. And so we're okay, because that's the reason why I wait before I actually then go ahead and transmit. However, what people often forget is that being unlicensed and not having to have a license to operate your equipment does not mean that the spectrum is unregulated. There are rules for operating in this spectrum, and those rules differ when you go around the world. So in this country, predominantly what you're going to see is you're going to see the 2.4 gigahertz band. And of course, when I say this country, I am referring to the US, which is where I reside. You may or may not be residing in the US. But in the US, we have the 2.5 and we have the 5 gigahertz bands. And in this country, in the 2.4 gigahertz band, the maximum transmitted power from your transmitter is 1 watt. And if you go above this, you'd actually be breaking those regulations. And so one of the things you have to be careful of is if you get an access point and you decide to connect an external antenna, you really have to make sure that you don't break the regulatory issues on this. And there is a transmit power regulation, which is what I was talking about here. And there's also an effective radiated power, which is what we call the ERP, the effective isotopic radiated power. Ooh, too many I's there. And that's down at 6 dBi. And so there are regulations, and in the 5 gigahertz band, the same thing. But in the US, the 5 gigahertz band is broken up into different chunks of spectrum, referred to as the Uni 1, the Uni 2, the Uni 2 Extended, and the Uni 3. And you'll notice if you buy an access point which is meant for internal use, it typically only operates on these spectrum bands here. And if you buy an access point meant for external use, it'll operate potentially on these frequencies. And the reason is that this band here has a regulation of 1 watt, which you typically would use outdoors, and this one here is regulated at 40 milliwatts, which is what you want to have if you're in an indoor environment. And of course, lots of different data, and this varies as you go to different countries around the world. The main thing here is to remember, if you're deploying Wi-Fi, do not assume it's unregulated. If you're doing external antennas, please consult a professional that really understands these regulatory issues so that you know when you're within legal limits. And the other thing, of course, is to bear in mind that those regulations vary when you go around the world. So please don't take an access point that you bought overseas and then deploy it in a different country, because that will also expose you to potentially breaking regulatory rules. Interesting stuff, right? Okay, so let's go on to our next one. So this is more of a deployment issue, and very important to understand this. So what a lot of people do is they pop up an access point and they look at the coverage and they say, oh, this is great, you know, let me draw it over here for you. Here's my coverage. And so I'm losing coverage here, so why don't I put up another access point like this? And by butting them up, I've really allowed myself continuous coverage. Well, there's a problem with this, is that you actually do need overlapping coverage. And if you don't have overlapping coverage, what can happen is that when you roam between them, you can actually find holes in the coverage area where users will actually lose their connection, actually drop their TCP/IP connection, and therefore phone up the IT department and say, hey, this wireless stuff doesn't work. And you have to go back out, therefore, and work out what the problem is. And finding holes in coverage can actually take quite a bit of time, because your RF environment is constantly changing, and there might be a hole there one moment, and in another moment it might go away. And so it's really important to make sure when you're planning your networks that you actually plan it with overlapping cell coverage. The question then becomes, well, how much overlapping cell coverage? And that varies as well. So if you're deploying your wireless networks for data only, i.e. your users are going to be surfing the web, downloading email, but you're not expecting them to do any real-time applications, like you're not expecting them to watch a YouTube video and have it play in real time, that they're happy to buffer it and play it a little bit later, or they're not making any voice calls, then typically you can overlap it somewhere between the 10 and 15% range. But if you're going to do voice and you want to make sure that you don't have any holes in coverage and you can effectively hand off a voice call as users are moving between access points, then what you need to do is add more overlapping coverage. And so you want to increase that up to about 20%. Now, of course, I'm sure some of you have noticed that if you increase the coverage and the overlap, what's going to happen is you're going to have to deploy more access points, which adds more dollars to your deployment. So what I've observed over the years is that many IT professionals will roll out their access points with kind of minimal overlapping coverage. It's kind of good enough. It gets people connected wirelessly, and it gets it up, and they can justify the cost. And then what happens as as users increase the traffic, as things get more busy, perhaps more interference comes into the environment, more problems start to occur, and then what happens is they have to go back out and redesign their networks. And that's when they call someone like me in to come in and solve the RF problems. And it's typically a problem with just not having done a good site survey in the first place and really set this overlapping channels effectively in the beginning, and realizing that you're better off paying out for a few access points at the beginning than running into the user problems that you're going to incur if you try to thin them out and minimize the actual expenditure at the get-go. So remember that it can cost you more in the long run when you actually have to come back in and re-architect everything. So remember, always do a site survey, always look at what applications you're running, and choose the overlapping percentage wisely, because this will get you later on. Okay, so let's go on to my next one. So here, this is a really interesting one as well, and it's all about the antennas. And I mentioned to you earlier to be careful if you do use external antennas to keep within the regulatory issues. But it's really very advantageous to use an access point that will allow you to do external antennas. So say, for instance, you know, you've got the corner of your office, and you could put an access point here with an omni antenna and radiate out in a circular fashion all the way out to the edges of the building. But another option for you would be to put an access point here with a 90-degree antenna, so it gives you a nice beam like this. And the advantage of this is that you're not spilling over outside of the building where you really don't want to have signals. You're not looking for anybody to connect out there. And it doesn't really provide a security solution, but it certainly prevents people accidentally eavesdropping onto your network. And the advantage is that this can often be advantageous from a coverage perspective, can actually improve your coverage. But to do this, you need to have an access point with an external antenna. Now, I've often found what happens with people when they get antennas is that they actually think that it boosts the signal, and it doesn't. What it's doing is taking the existing power and forcing it in a different direction. So, for instance, if it's radiating out like this, if I get a directional antenna, then I can take that same energy that was radiated out like this in this circular pattern and now just force it in this direction. So it's not amplifying the signal, it's just pushing that energy in one direction. It's much like as if you took one of these horns, like it's showing here, like people use at a football match. When they want to be heard across the field, they're shouting or talking and they're forcing that energy into this direction, so it forces your voice into this direction, and someone behind you can't hear you as well, but the people in front of you can hear you better. It's the same thing with antennas. They're not changing the power, they're just changing the radiated pattern. And so if you use a directional antenna, you have to remember that you're increasing the range in this direction, but you're reducing it, and users over here can no longer hear you. So remember that. It is not changing the radiated power, it is just changing the radiation pattern that is forming. So remember that, and when you choose your external antenna, choose one that's giving you the desired coverage, i.e. look at the specs and it will actually show you the patterns that it expects to achieve. And remember this other point when it comes to antennas. I often like to tell this story about a friend of mine that I've worked with who's a long-term IT person, been in the industry for years, and he sent me this picture of his access point. and he had it sitting on top of his desktop like this, and the antennas were pointing out like this. And he said to me, Avril, I'm not getting very good coverage. And I said to him, are you sitting on the roof by any chance? Because his coverage would have been like this, because his antennas were sticking out sideways. So I told him, you know, you need to place your antennas like this for at least consumer grade access points, and then they'll radiate out like this, and then maybe you'll get it in the garden, and maybe you should put it on top of the bookshelf. So I've seen some people do some funny things with their antennas, and again, antennas define your radiation pattern, and if you put them near any obstacles or point them in the wrong direction, your radiation pattern is going to be in places where you may or may not want it. So, very important to understand that. Okay, this is another very important point to realize, and it really relates back to doing the site survey. And this is such a common mistake. I must have seen this, I would say probably 70% of the site surveys that I get called in to fix the problems, this is what they do wrong. What they do is they will do their site survey using an access point that maybe they've got from an electronic store, or maybe is one that was left over. And they do it with this access point, and they go, oh, you know, look, I've done my site survey and I've worked out, if I put an access point here, I get a coverage here, put an access point here, here's my overlapping coverage, I put another one here. So life's real good, I've worked it all out where I need to put my access point, and I've got the right overlapping coverage, etc. I know everything I need to do. And then what happens is that they say, well, I did the site survey using an access point from one vendor, or even the same vendor, but a different access point, and then they've decided to deploy a different access point. So maybe the access point that they did the investigation on, maybe it was using what we call a 3x3 MIMO, had 3 antennas, and now they're deploying one that just has 2 antennas because they decided that they wanted to go with a cheaper access point. Maybe they've upgraded and they did the survey with a lower cost one, and now they're deploying a more expensive one. What's going to happen is, if you use a different access point, you have to remember, especially with internal antennas, that those antennas are inside this access point, and a different vendor or a different product may have positioned them differently. They also, the way that they've actually dealt with the losses as those signals go around this circuitry and out to the antennas can differ. So there's so much difference on this internal electronics that what's going to happen is that you're going to find your coverage is going to change. So you might find, oh, I deploy these other access points, and what happens is my coverage is improved. And you go, oh, Avril, what's wrong with that? Because doesn't that just mean I've got more overlapping coverage? Well, yes, but it also means that if you've got access points that are operating on the same frequency, maybe this is frequency 1 and this is, sorry, channel 1 and this is channel 1, well, now they're going to interfere more with each other. So more coverage is not necessarily good. You could find that the new access point has less coverage, in which case you may find that you have holes. So again, your coverage may be different. I mentioned that you may change the antennas. There may be some other things that are different that could change the data rates that you're able to achieve. So that will therefore have a major impact on the capacity. So if you've planned your network to support so many users and catered for a growth path, then all of a sudden you might find yourself having problems. So coverage and range go together, and again, if you're going to change anything at all, change your antennas, change your access points, range will be affected, which directly then relates to the data rates. The other thing, of course, is that different radios have different sensitivities. And so, you know, this access point could have Broadcom silicon in it, this could have Intel silicon in it, and so those silicon are going to respond a little bit differently and have different sensitivity. So this access point may be able to get to higher data rates with a low received signal, and this one may not. And so again, different products, different coverage. Make sure you plan your network with the access points that you actually plan to deploy in your networks. Wonderful. Okay. So the next one here, I mentioned this earlier. Always, always, always do a site survey. I have said so many people send me pictures or call me and say, Avril, I have a problem. And I'll ask them to send me some pictures, and I'll see the most weirdest thing. And the problem with Wi-Fi is that if you just pop up an access point and you put it anywhere, you're going to be able to connect. You're going to be able to connect and send data. And you'll go, wow, that's fantastic, Avril. Why is that a problem? Surely that's a great thing. Well, it would be, except that you're not optimizing your network. So what I often find is that people will say, you know, I've got this office here where I've got all my switches and my servers, and so it's like a storage room. Why don't I just put my access point in there, and you know, I just put it on a rack with all of my other switches, etc. And of course it radiates out and it gives me some coverage. But what's going to happen is the coverage is not going to be very good. And so if you'd taken that access point and maybe deployed it on a ceiling like it was meant to be done, and actually look at your cell coverage, what you would have found is that your data rates would have been a lot better and your coverage would have been a lot better, which means your throughput and your user complaints would be a lot better, or at least you'd have less user complaints. So it's really important that you do a site survey, no matter how small your business is. You may be tempted to say it's working, but trust me, you haven't really got it optimized and giving your users the best experience. When you do your site survey, things you want to watch for is the physical location and then your customer requirements, because both of these are unique. You know, one of the things I was working on a few months ago, I was working for a bank, and they said to me, all of our branch locations are identical. Therefore, we're going to put our access points in the same place. And I said, you know, they're really not. You may have laid out your cubes and offices to be identical, but things are actually quite different. You'll be surprised. Different parts of the states will use different material for building walls, for constructing things. It's quite different. You'll find people will move filing cabinets. They'll put up plants. People will congregate in different areas. They will conduct themselves slightly differently. Maybe one area has more inventory in a certain location than others. Maybe one branch has literally more users than other branches simply because of their demand for their customers. And of course, interference can be different. Just because you say your layout in your branch is okay, you don't know what's next to you. You know, you may have a butcher shop next to you, or you may be sitting next to a McDonald's with one of those free Wi-Fi that's blasting across into your branch location. So there's enough differences on your physical location that you still need to do a site survey, even if your physical layout is the same. As I mentioned, every customer is unique, and you have to ask the questions. And trust me, even after all these years of doing site survey, I always get surprised. There's always something that I forget to ask the customer they don't think about telling me we go to roll out and we go, oh, did I not tell you that we do that? And it can be really bizarre things. Like, for instance, you may find that they've got an application which is very, very heavy in terms of needing to be high data rates, low latency, and jitter rates, and they just didn't tell you about it. They said, no, we don't need to support voice. All of our applications are, you can suffer some latency, and you find this one application they didn't tell you about because they just use it at the end of the year when they're doing their Christmas inventory. And of course, it's done at a disastrous time during the year. And so it can be really difficult to find all of these questions. One of the things you'll see I did on the site survey course for Train Signal is I actually created some questionnaires to kind of help you go through what are the questions you should ask, how do you ask them, how do you dig around. One of the things that I always like to do is I like to go and sniff the wired network, because when I sniff the wired network, I often find things that the users forget to tell me and the IT department forget to tell me, or they just didn't realize what was happening on the network. Because what happens is what's on wired networks will go wired. So again, ask the right questions, don't hesitate, don't make any assumptions. There's going to be something that's going to surprise you. The earlier you find it, the better off you are. So, okay, it may seem a little bit strange to say this, but a lot of people say to me, wireless is a black art. And it really isn't. It's really not a black art. It's just they're hard to predict. It's very hard when your signals leave this access point to actually say what's going to happen to it, because it depends on what's going on in your RF environment. For instance, your signal might reflect off a surface. So, if you've got mirrors, metal, those kind of surfaces, they have a tendency to reflect the signal and give you a very good bounce signal, which could be bad and it could be good depending on what you're trying to do and where you're trying to get coverage. The other thing, although we don't typically see this with Wi-Fi because we're down at the lower signals, frequency levels, but up at the higher frequencies, what can happen is when it hits the building, the wavelength of the signals, if that is close to the roughness of the surface, what happens is the signal will actually, instead of reflecting, will actually kind of scatter like this, which can be really disastrous if you're trying to get the signal. And then you have this strange thing called diffraction. You see that when you have a bath. If you have a bath, I don't know if you have young children, but I always do this with young children. I stick my finger in the bath water, and you can see that my finger bends or appears to bend, even though my finger is still straight. That's the property of diffraction, when light appears to bend around surfaces. And so again, it's given me coverage where, you might not otherwise expect it. Why would you expect anything here if I'm behind the building? Well, because it's diffracting, or maybe it's reflecting off a surface and coming down here. The other thing, of course, is it gets absorbed. So I always like to think of my body rather than as a blob of fat. I like to think of it as a blob of water. And of course, signals get absorbed by water. So if you have a lot of people congregating and other obstacles, you're going to find that those signals get absorbed as well. So it's not that it's a black art. It is actually can be defined with the laws of physics. It's really complicated, and a lot of models don't take this into account. What they do, a lot of modeling will actually say to you, okay, I'm going to predict this. This is what I think it is, and then it will take some measurements and take some actual measurements, stick them in the prediction, and realign the prediction model, and then come out with your plan. Because most models, to include all of these different things is so complicated, it's better just to give you a kind of a basic model that kind of predicts it, then ask you to do some measurements to kind of make it a little bit accurate, and then out pops some sort of plan which you can then use for predicting where to put your access points. So, you know, it's just hard, but it's certainly not a black art. No. Okay, coming close to the end. Two more things to tell you. So a link budget. People kind of get scared when they're doing a link budget. But I tell you, this is no more complicated than balancing your checkbook. It's just different terms that we need to use when it comes to a link budget. What we're looking at here is, you know, if I'm here and this is my access point, and I'm going to transmit, and I'm transmitting at a given power. So let's say my transmitter is at, let's make it 200 milliwatts, and I'm using a 3 dBi antenna, so that's going to give me a bit of gain, and I'm propagating over the air, and then here's my receiving device. And so here's my receiving device, my laptop. We've got an internal antenna, and then we have a receiver. So what I need to make sure is that I receive enough power here to be able to recover your signal at the receiver, to be able to take it from waveforms back to ones and zeros. And so a link budget simply takes, my transmit power, my antenna gain, the losses that I get over the air, any gains that I have on the device, on the antennas in the device, and do I have enough receive power, i.e. am I above the receiver sensitivity to get back to your ones and zeros? And we just add it up, but we add it up in logs. And the reason why we log it is so that we can add it up. So we convert this to a dB, and we literally go, I'm going to add this to this, to my over-the-air propagation loss. Maybe it's a 7 dB loss over the air. Maybe I've got a 2 dB gain here. And I simply add all of this up to see if I've received enough at the receiver. How simple can you get? You do it in dBs because I can add it up, i.e. it's a log. That takes you back to school when you were doing logs, right? It really is as simple as that. It's just like doing a checkbook. This is how much money I have. This is how much I've spent. Oh my goodness, I'm in an overdraft situation, or oh my goodness, I've got enough money left that I've paid all my bills. If I'm in an overdraft situation, you go, oh my goodness, crisis. And in the case of radio, what that means is if you haven't got enough link budget, then you need to bring your devices closer, i.e. your coverage is less than you anticipated. So just like balancing a checkbook, a link budget tells you where your coverage is, how far away you can go from the access point, and then of course from that you can work out your capacity using those data rates that we started this webcast on, i.e. close to the access point I can get to the higher data rates, further away the lower ones, and so you can work out what the average capacity is of your cell. Isn't that simple? Okay. Last one, and then we're going to open up for questions. So here, what we're looking at here is interference. This is a picture of my network at home. And let me explain this picture. So at home, I live in the middle of the countryside, and I cannot hear my neighbor's access points. They are just too far away. And so for this test, what I did is I deployed one access point. In this case, it was an HP access point. And in this case, I'm deploying 802.11n, and I'm deploying it in the 2.4 gigahertz band. And 802.11n has an option to go to a 40 megahertz channel, and that's what's shown here in red. This distance between them here, this is my 40 megahertz channel where I'm transmitting data. So when I transmit, I'm going to be transmitting on that band, and that's what you can see. That red is highlighting my transmissions. You will notice, however, even though I live in the country and I have no other access points turned on and I cannot hear the neighbors, you will notice here there's all these yellow things popping all over the place. I should change my pen color here so you can see my lines as I'm drawing them. So you can see here all this yellow stuff. Well, what is that? Well, I know it's not Wi-Fi, because if it was Wi-Fi, I would recognize the signals. It would look a little bit like this. So what is this? I had no Bluetooth operating. My microwave oven was turned off. All of those, I don't have any cordless phones. So I went off investigating what this could be. Now, in my home, I actually have solar power. And my solar power system sits on the roof of my barn, and it transmits to a little receiver that's in my home, and it tells me, oh, Avril, the sun generated this much power today. And so this uses a proprietary wireless technology that happens to operate in the 2.4 gigahertz band. And you can see it was causing me interference, but you can see it was below and low enough here such that I was still able to send my data. But if I actually took my laptop over here out in the yard and sat here, that signal became strong enough, and of course I was further away from my access point such that these would actually cause interference, and I saw a significant drop in my data rate caused by this interference. So interference, it impacts my performance, and it does that for several reasons. One, the one I told you about before, in Wi-Fi, I listen. So this is time, and there's all this noise going on, then I'm not going to transmit. Oh, now it's quiet. I'm listening. It's still quiet. Okay, I'll go ahead and send my data frame. So I don't transmit when there's a lot of noise, and then I need to have it quiet for a period of time before I transmit. And then when I transmit my data, if an interference source comes along, it's going to be all over this, and I'm going to lose my data frame and have to retransmit. So all of these things, what that does is it reduces my throughput. So for most people, you want to actually try to remove interference sources from your RF environment. Sometimes you can't do that, but sometimes you can. So sometimes, for instance, you could move all your cordless phones, for instance, to operate on a different channel away from the access point that's close to it. Or you choose a channel for your access point that's away from the sources of interference. So try to avoid interference as much as possible and measure your interference, because if you know what your interference is, you're going to be able to do a better job of site planning, a better job of planning your network. So that was my last of 10. We're right on time. I went 45 minutes, and so now we're going to open that up for your questions. So I see a question here. What kind of tools can you use to find or isolate Wi-Fi holes? That's a great question, really great question. So, there's a few tools that I like to use. Particularly when you're looking for Wi-Fi holes, what you're looking for is you have to listen on the RF. So you're listening for the physical layer. And the physical layer, one of the things that I really like to use is a very inexpensive tool called Channelizer, and I always spell it wrong. So I believe it's one N, and it's actually an A here. But it's by MetaGeek, and that's a great tool. It's fairly inexpensive, and you can buy it for the 2.4 and the 5 gigahertz band. And why I like it is because it's fairly easy to use if you're not an RF expert, and it actually shows you, images, if it's Bluetooth, it's going to be looking like this. If it's Zigbee, it's kind of going to look like this. So it actually gives you different profiles for different sources of interference. And so I particularly like this tool. If you're an RF engineer, then you really want to get a good spectrum tool. And of course, the one I talk about in the course is the Cisco Spectrum Expert, but it's pretty expensive. This one we're talking about hundreds of dollars, so maybe $200–300, I think. This one, it's been a while since I bought mine. This one's up about $3K. But of course, this is much more sophisticated, and this is the Cisco Spectrum Expert. And the reason I do that in the course is that you need to be aware of that if you're going to get Cisco certified. But there are other Spectrum Expert tools which are, in my opinion, a little bit easier to use than the Cisco Spectrum Expert in terms of the form factor, a little bit easier to carry them around. The other thing, I'm sorry to give you such a long answer, but the other thing that you'll see is that you may be able to go on into the App Store or the Google Marketplace and download an app to your smartphone. The difference is, and the same thing goes here with Channelizer, if you use your smartphone to assess interference, remember that your antenna is inside the access point. Inside the client. And so it's a little bit more difficult. It can give you some distorted results. Typically, when you use a tool, what I think is better, in my opinion, and it gives you more uniform results, is to plug in an adapter. Use a Wi-Fi adapter here. That's for the RF bands that you want to do the inspection for, but that actually can be a lot better than using the internal antenna of your device. So this is very cheap, maybe $1 to $5. This one, a few $100s, nice IT solution. This one if you're a IT expert. Now, the other question, which kind of builds on this, is this is at the physical layer. The other thing that's really fun to do is to sniff the packets. And so this here would be at the layer 2. So this is a great question to be asking. This is at the layer 2, so you're looking at MAC packets as opposed to interference and noise. And this one I like to use here is AirPCAP. And I can't quite remember who it's from, but it's AirPCAP. And the reason why, it's AirPCAP, yeah, I think I spelled that right. No H, there we go, AirPCAP. My apologies there for my spelling. The reason I like to use this tool is that it works with Wireshark. So the reason I like it, therefore, is I find that most IT people are familiar with Wireshark, know how to do filters, and so AirPCAP, if you put in an AirPCAP into your laptop, so you plug in your AirPCAP adapter, make sure you've got an adapter that works with AirPCAP. What you're going to find is that, you're going to be able to start, here's a beacon, here's a data frame, here's an acknowledgement. So I start to see all of your data frames, but the GUI that for filtering, etc., is Wireshark, and you'll be really familiar with that. So that's a great question. Oh, okay, so we've got time for one more question, and the question is, what's the best security for security wireless now, for securing wireless now? Great question. So, I'm going to give you the best answer I can, and the best answer is to say, look, when you deploy your network, use WPA2. Please, if you've got access points that are using WEP, please upgrade them to WPA2, even if that means you need to replace your access points. Because if you're WEP, I can break into that within about 2 minutes and access your network. If you're WPA1 or WPA and not WPA2, there are known weaknesses on WPA. It takes more of an expertise to break it, but there are weaknesses. But there are no publicly announced weaknesses on WPA2. There are two types of WPA2. One is called WPA2 Enterprise. One is called WPA2 Personal. If you're a small business or a hotel or a residential, you typically will use Personal. And this uses a private shared key. So, you know, you have a key which you put into your device, and you have a key which is in one of the network components. WPA2 Enterprise uses 802.1x. So it uses port-based authentication. This can be quite complicated to set up. A lot of people bring me in for that very purpose. Hey, help me set this up. It's very complicated. Once it's set up, it works real well. But a lot of IT people find it hard. So that's why I say I find a lot of small businesses will use WPA Personal simply because they don't have the IT expertise to do 802.1x. But I would encourage you, if you do have the expertise, to use WPA2 Enterprise with an 802.1x port-based authentication. And that should make you secure over the wireless link. Of course, you still have to think about wireline security, the deployment of firewalls and filters and access control lists, all of those things. Here I was purely talking about the over-the-air wireless part of your network. Put in WPA2 if definitely WPA2, and then choose between these depending on the size of your business and your IT support. And of course, I also want to tell you, you can always connect to me through the Train Signal website, or you can connect to me with LinkedIn. You can just Google my name. I'm one of the only ones out there. You'll find me, and you can connect to me there as well if you like. And happy to answer any more questions after this webcast.